Welcome to the Autonomic Healing Podcast. I'm Tom Pells.
And I'm Ruth Lawrenson. We'll be unpacking what it looks like to activate your brain to holistically manage stress and trauma that bring healing to the mind, body, and spirit.
Being free to live authentically as humans.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started. We are looking at this topic of the seemingly rational perceptions. We've been talking about this in the last couple of episodes now. And so I would just like us to catch up anyone who's just coming in. We're talking about autonomic healing activation in the problem solving space.
Yep.
So if you want to kind of catch up in the somatic, how it impacts the body, you're going to have to go right the way back to episode 1, Tsunami of Stress. But we are in this little mini series, so to speak, of what it looks like for AHA, autonomic healing, when we activate that homeostasis and how it impacts our perceptions, the way we feel, the way we think. Do you want to just give us a little recap to kind of catch people up?
Yep.
Yeah.
So human beings are body, mind, and spirit. And that tsunami of stress, the flight or fight reaction, and then how that develops, try to get away from, flee, avoid the threat. And that's when we sense a sense of stress and need. And then when we can't get away from it, then the fight kicks in. And that's the distress and the discontent. And that happens in the body.
Yeah.
That's just a reaction. And whether we're a human being or a bunny rabbit, the brain just goes there as a reaction to sensed or perceived threat to well-being. And so with AHA, that is a way to be able to normalize that just reactive in the body, in the flight or fight reaction. And that is part of it. Mm-hmm. That's the body part.
So that's the somatic work, which is what we always start with autonomic healing.
Yes.
So anyone who would come to see you as a client, that's the starting point. And there's various different reasons that people come and see you, but it's, some incredibly traumatic, and then some just like, actually, I've been trying therapy for 5 years and I've heard about this and I understand that stress and trauma can be stored in the body. So I need to reset my body in that way.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to normalize that trauma reactivity so that it isn't the norm, and there is a sense of peace and well-being, contentment, and to have a way when you need it. And it's not like stress doesn't happen and people aren't going to do things and things are not going to happen that trigger stress and need. They are, but to have a tool to be able to manage the somatic reaction to that in that flight or fight that just wants to take off, and to normalize that, that's huge. But that's only one of 3 aspects of us as human beings. And there's a second aspect that contributes to stress and need, and that's our perceptions. Because having interacted with people, having been raised by humans, and humans tend not to be actually rational, but we may think we are. And we have what I call seemingly rational perceptions. There is the rational and irrational. I think the reason that I talk about it as seemingly rational perceptions as opposed to irrational is because they occur on a spectrum. So rather than black and white, it's rational or it's irrational, the perceptions seem rational to us because they've been rewarded, they've been reinforced. A people pleaser is classically a perception that I call love me tender. And it's my significance, my worth as a human being is directly tied to getting the acceptance, the love, approval, admiration. And if I sense that I may not, and I think I may not, on no basis whatsoever, but I suspect I might not. And then we have that negative anticipation that kicks in because I know I'm going to be abandoned. I'm going to be rejected. And a couple of episodes ago, when I shared about a problem solving session that I had done with somebody who struggled with abandonment and rejection. Why do I think I'm being abandoned when I'm not loved tenderly? Well, that client's primary perception was that one I call love me tender. Mm-hmm. And the first thought that came into her perception was, why do I think I'm being abandoned when I'm not loved tenderly? Because I think it's true. And love me tender believed that it was not true. Mm-hmm. And then her pattern, the next one, was sitting on the dock. Mm-hmm. And that's the perception. And the reason I call it that is because that Otis Redding song, which is sitting on the dock of the bay. And for 2,000 miles I roamed just to make this dock my home. Watching the ships come in and watch them roll away again. I can't do what 10 people tell me to do, so I guess I'm just going to stay the same. And it's not as though he hadn't done a lot. He'd wandered for 2,000 miles. Mm-hmm. But in the end, he didn't believe it was going to make any difference. And that's that sitting on the dock perception. And there are a number of different perceptions. Mm-hmm. So where her first thought was, because I think it's true, and Love Me Tender says, I am not loved tenderly, so I'm being abandoned. Mm. Then the sitting on the dock came in with, I'm not loved. That was the second of those two perceptions that just came involuntarily into her awareness because we think in a pattern. And that's what I discovered, is that there's a pattern to the way that we just process thoughts.
There's so much there already that I want to unpack. Okay. Yeah. First off, I love the fact that I think it's so important that the clarification on you haven't called it irrational perceptions. And I think one of the things that is helpful, has been helpful for me, and I think it will be helpful for our listeners, is that, to be irrational is pretty obvious, right?
Oh, and it's extreme.
Yeah, it's extreme.
It's the person with road rage and they want to destroy other people.
You're having a massive argument with someone and you're just being irrational.
And you know it.
And we've all had irrational moments. And, maybe in the moment you don't know it, but at least afterwards it's very, very recognizable. But I think what we're hitting here, and I think it's so wise that you didn't call it that, because these are seemingly rational perceptions. Mm-hmm. So they're so much more subtle than the irrational moments that we have. These are kind of part of how we have been shaped, how we've been formed, positively or negatively. Mm-hmm. And we have these perceptions that can seem rational to us, and yet they end up being detrimental with how we relate to ourselves and to others.
Yep. Correct. To situations in life. Mm-hmm. Yes. So they seem rational to us.
So yeah, I hope that our listeners can grasp that, because in our last episode we talked about phobias, which is a very particular, seemingly rational perception, right? Mm-hmm. Which it was amazing to talk about that, because I think there is actually big headway with autonomic healing to correct some phobias. But I think also some of the things that really have an impact aren't so obvious as phobias either. Mm-hmm. They're the things like you just mentioned, people pleasing, or perfectionism, or maybe feeling like I just like the sitting on the dock of the bay. I can't do anything, so why bother?
I'll do, but I just don't think it's going to make any difference in the end. But I will try. And I will keep doing things. And in AHAPS, it's activating the brain to engage in cognitive homeostasis, so that the brain itself, classically experienced in what's described as a eureka moment or an aha moment, of that realization of a solution to a problem. Mm-hmm. And in the AHAPS, it's a 2-hour session. And in the first part of that, we identify a distinct pattern that we just think in. And it's a pattern of 4 perceptions that I just kept observing over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And I was real good about seeing patterns, and I'm all about seeing patterns. And I kept seeing the same pattern over and over and over again. And the more I explored that, the more I realized how distinctive a pattern it is. And it always happens.
Yeah. And so just to recap, so, most people go to you for AHA. It's the main session, resetting stress and trauma in the body through the activation of homeostasis, which is, we've talked about so much in past episodes. And then there is AHA PS, problem solving. That's what it stands for, right? PS.
Yes.
And that is offered as a next step. Not everyone takes it, but it's offered as a next step in therapy. And this is where, and in that first session, that 2-hour session, you help people understand what their pattern is.
Yep, they identify it.
And they have 4...
And it's just very strange, but there is a distinct pattern of 4 perceptions.
4 perceptions.
That occur in order and then repeat. And it always does it.
And in all, I mean, you've mentioned a couple of them already.
Mm-hmm.
So Love Me Tender you've just mentioned, that's actually my first one. And so whenever you talk about it, I'm like, oh yeah, now I know it's there.
Yep.
As my first seemingly rational perception. So that means it just seems rational to me.
Yes, and it does, because it's been treated as that. And logically, we problem solve.
Yes.
And see, that's the interesting thing about logical. Something can be completely logical and not rational at all. It's very interesting. If logic is if this, then that, and if that, then that, and if that, then that, and it's logical. But if the fundamental perception is not actually rational to start with, it's completely logical, and that's how we can rationalize all sorts of solutions or decisions, but we're rationalizing them, which doesn't make it rational. It just means it's logical, it makes sense, but if you start with a premise and a perception that is not actually rational, but only seems rational, you're just creating more problems.
Yeah. So, through your time as a therapist, what you've come up with is that you've just been observing these patterns, and there's actually 12 seemingly rational perceptions that you've identified.
You can find lists of all sorts of numbers, and classic cognitive behavioral therapy, that's identifying a perception that's not actually rational and trying to come to a place through processing or whatever, or debating it or whatever. It's all about identifying perceptions, and you can find lists of perceptions. When I was first working as a mental health therapist, I was working on that master's degree, was introduced into cognitive behavioral therapy. Very effective, because a lot of the problems and stress in our lives are functions of not actually thinking rationally about things, and then getting carried away with that. And when I got into forensic psychotherapy, got into the deep end of the pool of human perceptions that are skewed and not actually rational, to the point that it's criminal to think that way. And the whole realm of criminal thinking, I was a fellow named Samenow, who literally wrote the book on criminal thinking. And there are all sorts of different manifestations of and paradigms for distorted ways to think, and you can find lists and lists and lists and lists, but what I noticed is that a lot of those are just sort of variations on a theme. It's just a different way of looking at the very same thing. Like a banana is a banana, And whether that is a really large yellow banana or a small green one, it's still a banana.
Mm-hmm.
And, but to sort out ones that are distinctively different from others, it's in the realm of 12.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
but I think the key is not just, I think one of the things that you're right, because when I encountered this with you for the first time and understood what my 4 seemingly rational perceptions were, it felt, similar to, I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. This feels like Enneagram or it could be any of those things. And so I think giving language, language to these perceptions is incredibly helpful, because it kind of you begin to understand why, just like the Enneagram, and I'm not completely comparing them, but just like the Enneagram, how people, they love identifying with their number because it helps them understand who they are. And I think with the perceptions that you've come up with, it's very similar. However, I think the thing that's really different in my experience that I've never encountered before is the pattern.
Yep.
So,
and that is distinctively different than any other.
The pattern that seems to go along with the tsunami of stress.
Yep.
And it's almost like one after the other, and then repeat.
Yep.
So, yeah, I find that fascinating. So what happens in AHA PS 2-hour session? Someone comes to you, you always do it after the somatic. You never do it really before.
I've done it a few times before, only with people who just, for whatever reason, will not do the somatic. See, when stress or need, flight or fight, is activated, if you normalize that in the body, then you can think about it differently than if it's not normalized in the body. And then you don't have a trauma reactivity. EMDR, for example, one of the things that is really very characteristic of that is that because it's a cognitive process and it's attempting to reprocess perceptions of it, since that's not normalized in the body, you're awakening trauma, which is why it can be really upsetting to do EMDR, even as it's helpful to reprocess the perception, which is another version of psychotherapy. You're changing the way or altering the way you think about it from traumatized, stressed, irrational to more rational, reasonable, but without having normalized that trauma in the body, you're awakening it by thinking about it.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a safer way of approaching it.
It is. And I've done AHA sessions with people who have been referred by their psychotherapist or psychologist who were doing EMDR, and they were referred to me so they could restore the normal function, the non-traumatized somatic source of that, so that they could even continue doing EMDR, because that makes a huge difference. So with these perceptions, and you mentioned the Enneagram, and any personality inventory is all about identifying patterns of perceptions, because we think in patterns. With the 4, that pattern of 4, a primary fallback, a secondary fallback, there are 4 perceptions. And with that, we just think in those orders. And with the problem solving, though, we're allowing the brain itself to think, and then to inform the conscious mind with involuntary thoughts that the brain produces that actually do problem solve, because we're dealing with a part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is all about executive function and personality expression, which is why any personality inventory that identifies that, it's dealing with perceptions. And the questions are all about, what do you think about, or what is your opinion about? And That's because that's the part of the brain that is responsible for personality expression. It's the thinking part of the brain. And it's also responsible for problem solving. So if you've got a problem that you're trying to figure out, it's the prefrontal cortex that you're using in connection with the limbic system. The limbic system is memory and learning, and that's the hippocampus. And the amygdala is sensing and deciding, should I have a flight or fight reaction? Some of that is conscious. Most of it is not conscious. It's not a function of the mind. It's a brain function. Mm. And with the prefrontal cortex, that's the problem solving and decision making part of the brain. And what I've discovered is a way to and this is the PS session, is to let the brain itself solve the problem and inform the conscious mind with involuntary thoughts that it naturally wants to generate, just doesn't have the opportunity to. And then the brain solves problems that the mind can't come up with. Mm. And one of the reasons that cognitive therapy, cognitive behavioral, dialectical behavioral, any type of cognitive therapy or psychotherapy where there's an attempt to shift those underlying beliefs and opinions and perceptions, the reason it's frequently not as effective as it could be is because it's either the therapist saying this is a different way to think about that, or the person trying to come up with it in their own mind, and the brain just going, do you really want to know? Because I can tell you what the actual answer is that is actually rational. And that's what happens in the problem solving session. The brain generates involuntary thoughts and ideas, presents that to the conscious mind. The person just says it out loud. I take dictation, and it follows the pattern. Not because I'm trying to have it fit a pattern, but because it just does.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I remember going through this myself and seeing those patterns of thoughts that come to that the brain comes up with. They follow those full perceptions and then adjust them to the actual rational alternatives.
Yes.
So one of the things that...
Which is amazing.
Let's talk about the actual rational, because it's not just an identification of these seemingly rational perceptions. So everyone that would come to you or an AHA therapist, if they went through AHA PS session, they would, one of the first things that would happen is that there would be this way of identifying the pattern. And what are those for? And there's primary and secondary. Primary and a primary fallback, and then secondary and a secondary fallback.
So it's a pattern of 4 perceptions. There is 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the first 2 form a pair. And that's what I call the primary pair. And then the second with the first, the second one is a fallback to the primary. Yeah. So there's the primary one, and then when that doesn't work, there's a fallback. And then the third one is the secondary. And then when that doesn't work, there's a secondary fallback, and that's the fourth one. And they just fall in order, and they follow the tsunami of stress. So the first one, and it's seemingly rational.
Do you want to talk about my ones?
Well, I was just going to use this one from the abandonment.
Okay, great. Yeah, example. Let's do that. Yeah.
Okay? So just to review that, this person had asked the question and allowed their brain to do an aha moment, and the brain itself is presenting involuntary thoughts and ideas to the person's conscious awareness. Just like in an classic aha moment where you've been thinking about something, you can't figure it out, then you stop thinking about it, you turn your attention to something else, the brain keeps thinking about it. Not you consciously, but your brain does. And it's the same part of the brain that you were using consciously, because we share that part of the brain with the brain itself functioning. And the brain itself keeps problem solving. And then when it comes up with it, it informs the conscious mind, and you're going, I know what I could do. Or, oh, I remember now. Because the brain came up with a solution, the brain remembered and informed you of what its work had been. And with the PS, it just naturally does that. So like in the example that I'd given a couple episodes ago, and you can get the full one if you listened to 2 episodes ago, the initial one on AHAPS, but this person, they had been in therapy for abandonment for years and years, and they'd made some progress, but that was still an issue because their brain had not problem solved what was that about. And then, so when we identified that pattern of perceptions, then that was the problem that client wanted me to address. They wanted to figure out, will my brain figure out abandonment? And it did. So the question that person came up with is, why do I think I am being abandoned when I am not loved tenderly? We activated homeostasis, said the question, and then her brain started generating thoughts and ideas that came into her awareness involuntarily. She just said them out loud. I took dictation. And the first thing out of her mouth was, because I think it's true. The second thing that came out of her mouth was, I am not loved. Third, not loved is abandonment. And then the next, it feels alone. And the next, it feels alone, so I am alone. Do you see the logic in it? But it's not actually rational. It feels alone, so I am alone. Was she alone? No. Did she feel alone? Yes. Did she perceive it as being alone? Yes. She was with someone who loved her. Loved her very much. But did she feel alone? Yep. And feeling alone is alone. And then the next, I need to be loved. I want to be loved. There is not another way. And eventually, her brain got her to the place, a dozen or so thoughts later, was, I want to be free. Free from the bondage of others. Free from the desperate need to be loved. It doesn't seem possible. How could that be possible? It feels so real. I don't even know what real is. And then a little bit later, can I be loved in that being difficult? I'm not sure. I want to be sure. And then her brain came up with this thought, I am accepted just as I am. That's actually rational. There's no reason not to be accepted just as we are, because it's how we are. And we can accept that. She couldn't accept that, but her brain did, and informed her of that because it was her brain doing it. She could believe it. And the next thought was, is that true? I want that to be true. I hope it is true. I can accept myself. She's not thinking this consciously. This is her brain presenting these thoughts to her conscious mind. I can accept myself. I can accept myself even when it feels like others don't love me. I like that. I want to live in that. That feels like freedom. Can I let go of others loving me? I don't know. But I am letting go. I have been letting go. I can let go. And when we got through all of that, then we went back and looked at that. And her pattern of perceptions began with, seemingly rationally, love me tender. And if she didn't have that approval, that acceptance, that love, that affirmation, then she didn't have worth.
And love me tender is a pretty common one, right?
Oh, that's a very common one.
Yeah.
Yeah, many people have that. And then her second one, her fallback to love me tender was sitting on the dock. she would do all sorts of things to try to get that acceptance, that approval, that love. But the fallback was she didn't really believe it was ever going to make any difference. Mm-hmm. It was just never going to happen. Mm-hmm. And so I just don't think it's going to make any difference. That's sitting on the dock. Mm-hmm. And then her third one was, here we go again. And here we go again is the idea that it's all about change. But the change isn't going to last. Even if something seems like it's going to change, it doesn't. And then always looking for something else that should change. And that's, here we go again. Mm-hmm. That should change. Mm-hmm. I should change. We should change. This situation should change. It's all about things that should change, but it's not going to make any difference. And then her fourth one was, I can't help it. And the reason I call it that is because being overly emotional, not just emotional, but not feeling like can manage your emotions in response to people or situations. And so her primary was love me tender. Mm-hmm. The second one, the primary fallback, was sitting on the dock. So
with sitting on the dock, what is that one again? Can you just explain?
That's it. It's not going to make any difference. So, I'll do, but it's not going to make any difference.
So I'll do it, but it's just this kind of defeatism. Then.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. And then her third one, here we go again. Mm-hmm.
So that's got a defeatist element in too.
Oh, yeah. On steroids then. Mm-hmm. Just takes it to another level. And then the I can't help it. And so for her, it began with, I've got to have this approval, this people pleasing. I've got to be able to do that. And then the sitting on the dock comes in, but it's not going to make any difference. But I'm going to do it, but it's not going to make any difference.
And then I can't help
And then here we go again comes in with, and that should change. I should change. That should change. He should change. Whatever should change. And then the I can't help it. It's not changing. And it's not going to change. And that follows that tsunami of stress. Mm-hmm. And so the stress and need for her was love me tender. And then the distress and the discontent. Here we go again. And then the avoidance and isolation. Here we go again. And then the resistance, I don't want to deal with it. Defiance, anger, and not being assertive, which for her made her very passive-aggressive, was getting overly emotional. Mm. And when those perceptions, it's like the brain said, okay, here's the real problem. And these are the issues because these are your perceptions. And then it shifted to, but there's an actual rational alternative to it. And so the first one, why do I think I'm being abandoned when I'm not loved tenderly? Because I think it's true. Why did she think it's true? Love me tender. Mm-hmm. If I'm not being loved tenderly,
then I'm
abandoned.
Yeah, I'm being abandoned, yeah.
And then I am not loved. That second one, sitting on the dock. Mm-hmm. I'm not loved. It's not going to make any difference. I do. I try. Mm-hmm. Doesn't make any difference. Mm-hmm. And then the third one, not loved is abandonment. And these are involuntary thoughts. She's not thinking this. Yeah. Her brain is giving her these pieces of information so that it can then shift them. And not loved is abandonment. Here we go again.
Yeah.
And then it feels alone. And the fourth one is, I can't help it. It feels alone. And I am feeling all of this. And
it's the overly emotional piece.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's why, because I think it's true, I am not loved. Not loved is abandonment. It feels alone. Follow those four perceptions. Mm-hmm. And it always follows the pattern of perception. Now, what each individual's pattern is their own. Mm-hmm.
So in a session, what happens is that in the activation of homeostasis, you present a problem. Each sentence follows the
Yep.
pattern of those perceptions.
It does.
In real life, like outside of the session, and I've noticed this in my own life, a problem comes up. I mean, you don't think of it as like, I'm going to ask my brain a problem, but you are facing a problem in your life. It could be anything. And then if you're not aware of it, you react by following those 4 steps.
Yeah, because they naturally,
and one leads
we
to the
think
next.
in those patterns.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
but with PS, if you know your pattern, you can say, wait a minute, stop. That's just love me tender. And then there can be that shift, because the actually rational alternative to love me tender is being loving. And I can be very loving, and that doesn't mean the other person's going to like it. They may not like it. They may not even approve of it. They may not accept me, but I'm being loving. Doing something in a way that actually is very beneficial. If you've ever dealt with a child, as a parent, you do all sorts of loving things for that child, and frequently that child is like, you don't love me! Because if you love me, you would give me that treat and let me stay up late and not go to bed. No, that's not loving. Night-night. Or, no, we'll have that special treat after the meal, and you've gotten some good food. That's actually loving. Does the child perceive it as that? No. Does the child potentially perceive it as rejection? Yes. Is that rational? No. So if you've ever dealt with a child, you understand this. That what's actually rational, the other person may not experience it that way or appreciate it that way, but it doesn't mean it isn't actually rational to be loving. And so the actually rational alternative to love me tender is to be loving. Which
I think is kind of like, I remember, like, that is my first one, love me tender. And I so identify with it. And it's like, oh my gosh, why am I love me tender? This is so dominating of my life. And I find myself in it so many times. It less now, but
and there it is.
It really is less now because I identify it quickly. However, I remember thinking, so it feels like I find it annoying about myself.
Then which is love me tender, and you're not accepting yourself because of that perception. Oh wait, that's not loving.
But
you can't be loving.
But I think it's annoying because it's like, why am I so affected by, like feeling that the thought of being rejected or the thought of not being affirmed, and I mean, if I go on, I'll tell you all of my other perceptions. But I think when I realised that actually the actual rational alternative is to be loving, there was like this redemption for me in that space, because I thought, oh, okay, I get that now, because I'm created in my little unique way to be a really loving person, which is why the very place of strength and gifting that I can offer someone, through stress and trauma can get, skewed and then puts me in the love me tender place.
Absolutely, because that's where it comes from.
So it just kind of made sense to me, like when I thought, and it also gave me motivation to think, okay, I don't have to be frustrated. Like, I can be kind to myself. And you know what? Sometimes I fall into love me tender and I don't stay there as long anymore.
Yep.
But it gives me direction of knowing where to go with a seemingly rational perception of like, I'm in love me tender again. Why am I in this? But now I'm like, okay, I'm actually loving. How can I, instead of, drowning in that tsunami of love me tender, now when I identify it, I think, okay, Ruth, the real you in this situation is to be loving, is to love really, really well. And what does that look like? And it helps me shift actually just knowing it helps me shift into that actually rational perception. So I love the fact that we have the alternatives.
Yes.
And that was just one that we talked about, Love Me Tender. But yeah, there's this really life-giving alternative that I guess we've talked about, that takes you into that rational intimacy that we've talked about.
And so for this person, they would go from Love Me Tender into sitting on the dock.
Mm-hmm.
So I can make it, I'll do, but I don't believe it's going to make any difference. And the actually rational alternative to that is service.
Mm.
And that doing things that benefit myself and others is satisfying and rewarding. And whether that person thinks it makes any difference or whether I think it makes any difference isn't really the point.
Yeah.
Was this something that I did of service, and was it beneficial to others and myself? Whether they saw it that way or not, whether they received it that way or not, that's actually rational, to be of service. And so for this person, to be of loving service is authentically who they were, and they resonated with that. And their brain actually got them to there when they said, can I be loved in that? That's the I can't help it.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, can I be loved in that?
Mm-hmm.
Nervous. And then to ask and to say, I'm not sure, was a very loving thing. Not to just categorically dismiss it, but to let it be present. I'm not sure. And their brain came up with that. And then the very next statement was, I want to be sure. And that's service. Mm-hmm. I want to be sure. It's not going to make any difference. I can't get... The brain said, I want to be sure. And that reflected service. And then the next statement that the brain came up with, I am accepted just as I am. Which is the actually rational alternative to here we go again, which is perseverance. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was the way things were, but that doesn't mean that that's inevitable. Things do change. Mm-hmm. Change can be lasting. And I am accepted just as I am is a statement of perseverance. Mm. I am accepted just as I am. Perseverance.
Yeah.
And then the next, is that true? And rather than, that's how I feel, is that true? And the confidence to ask a question like that, mm-hmm. which her brain had, not her mind, her brain. And then a very loving thing, I want that to be true. And what a loving statement for her brain to make to her. But because it was her brain, it was her. I want that to be true. Service? I hope that's true. And then perseverance, again, I can accept myself. Mm. And then the confidence, I can accept myself even when it feels like others don't love me. Mm-hmm. And rather than that, I can't help it, confidence. I can accept myself even when it feels like others don't love me. And then this loving next statement, I like that. I like that.
That's so cool.
And it just does that until at the end, the statements in the pattern were love me, not love me tender, loving. I can change. And then service, I can be loved. And then perseverance, I can allow God to love me. Talk about an ultimate in her life. Mm-hmm. Not just others, but God. And then confidence. I can allow myself to love me. What a statement of confidence. And then loving, I can be me. And then service, I don't have to be what other people want me to be. And what a statement of service to herself. Mm-hmm. And actually, that would be a statement of service to others. Because it's not a service to others to just simply be what they want you to be. That doesn't help them. It doesn't help you. It's not beneficial to either. But that service, I don't have to be what other people want me to be. And then perseverance, I can just be.
Mm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Tom. I think, and everyone obviously has their own pattern, but I think the example, hopefully, that's coming across is that what a different picture. There's this. The pattern either is the pattern of the tsunami of stress with seemingly rational perceptions, or the pattern takes you into rational intimacy.
Yeah.
And so you've got, someone who's, love me tender, like like no one loves me. I feel like abandoned. Like I can't do anything about it, so I may as well just sit on the dock of the bay. Here we go again, which is that whole kind of needing change, but it probably won't happen. And then I can't help it, which is just like giving up.
Overly
all of that compared to loving. Help me out here. Loving. What was the second one? Service. Perseverance
and confidence.
I mean, think about that pattern of I'm going to be loving, I'm going to be serving, I'm going to persevere, and I'm going to have confidence. A completely different outcome and personality.
Actually rational.
Yeah. And I remember talking to a couple of the guests that we've had on before about this. And I love having our guests on because we always share our experiences with, I think it was Racer who came on one time, who's actually, her episode's going to come out soon, but we were joking, we were like, do you remember when you did your first AHAPS? We cried, and she was like, there's lots of tears in AHA. But I remember that conversation with her, and I remember crying happy tears actually in AHAPS because for the first time I could see this picture with the actual rational alternatives of who I am. And I felt like I'm proud to be her. Yes. Whereas I'd never felt that really with all of the cumbersome nature of the tsunami of stress and my seemingly rational perceptions.
Yeah.
I knew actually, I didn't have the language for it, but I knew that some of those seemingly rational perceptions because I could feel the detrimental impact of them. So to be able to kind of go from there to go, oh, what? This is who I really am, and see it like that, and to see that there's this escalating pattern in the right direction in a way that I can live out being me, Ruth. And I think this is so true for everyone else who goes through this. It's really, really powerful. And obviously it doesn't just sit in that one session. No. It's something that you continue with. And so it's just you give people really good handles, I think, in terms of moving forward in their perceptions, moving from those seemingly rational perceptions that keep them in those stages of the tsunami of stress to the actual rational perceptions of who they really are.
Which allows us to experience that rational intimacy.
Yeah, so great.
Yeah.
We'll be exploring more and more of these perceptions as we go on. And obviously something we've not really touched on yet, but will, which is the spiritual side of AHA.
And the same perceptions show up there. Because in the spirit, that's our being. That's us as a human being. And those perceptions show up there as well.
So the perceptions are kind of through all of it, really. Yep. So, but those 3 stages of autonomic healing impact the body, the mind, which is the problem solving, and the spirit, understanding who we are in our being.
Yep. And one of the primary sources of stress is not what people are doing or not the situation in life. One of the primary sources of stress in our lives is the way we're thinking about it. And when you can manage that, you're managing a lot more stress in your life. And that's a wonderful thing.
It is a wonderful thing. Thanks, Tom. We'll connect in our next episode.
Yep. You've been listening to the Autonomic Healing Podcast.
Join us next time as we continue in our conversations with Tom. If you're interested in pursuing your own autonomic healing journey and want to find a practitioner, visit our website, innerworkings.org. See you at the next episode.